welcome everybody, and it's a beautiful evening. Really appreciate your joining us tonight for this talk by Akeia de Barros Gomes. She's our Curator of Social History at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and I'm Christina Brophy, the Chief Curator of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And this is the second installation of our Inside Out exhibition, and it's based on our Standard Times photography collection, and Akeia has curated this particular exhibit. And Jocelyn will have a slide at the end of the program that will talk about what's coming up next. But this is an opportunity for us to share our collections in reproduction form on the plaza for everyone to enjoy who is comfortable or not coming into the museum in person. So I want to welcome Akeia de Barros Gomes, and she will walk you through this wonderful exhibit of just absolutely fabulous photographs from the museum's collection. So welcome to Akeia, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Christina. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. And so before I get started, I just wanted to explain a little more about the Inside Out exhibition. As Christina said, it's our way of bringing the museum out into the community for, for the days that we are now not open, but also for members of the community that are not necessarily comfortable coming inside the museum just yet. One of the things we did with this particular exhibition is each curator created an exhibition and gave a little sort of the curator's perspective or curator's statement on why they chose their particular exhibition. And so I chose A City of Immigrants because we have this wonderful collection of images from the Standard Times, and I focused on turn of the century, really around 1905, because what you see when you look through our collection of images for that date is a lot of images of either existing or blossoming immigrant communities. And you get a sense from some of the articles that some of that is a little bit of an anxiety about immigration, but often it's a celebration of immigration, which I think is spectacular and very timely. And so I'm going to present to you some of those images, a couple of teasers from the exhibition, but also some images that aren't in the exhibition that capture the same communities during this time period. And so these are just some of the communities that are represented in our Standard Times collection. And again, this is turn of the century New Bedford. Circa 1905, some of them are a little earlier, some are a little later. And these are the communities that began and thrived at this time. And we often now think of New Bedford as an immigrant city. So we think about Quakers, Baptists, Pacific Islanders, the Portuguese, Cape Verdeans, French Canadians, Norwegian fishermen, Guatemalan laborers. This is by virtue, of course, of New Bedford being a seaport, and seaports are usually immigrant havens, and New Bedford in particular. So if we think about the era of whaling and beyond, New Bedford was a port of entry for several ethnic and national groups that dispersed throughout southern New England. And while every city has numbers of immigrants, in New Bedford, being known as an immigrant hub is a point of pride and is embraced as one of, if not the defining feature of the city. And here are just, again, a couple of the groups that are captured in our Standard Times collection. And so we have Cape Verde, the Middle East, Italy, China, Poland, Greece, Ireland, the Azores, and Germany and Eastern Europe. And believe me, if I could fit every group of people onto this slide, the text would be too small to read. And so I'm thinking about how timely this exhibition is and how timely this presentation is, as I was just last Sunday reading in the New York Times a feature on Kamala Harris, the daughter of a Jamaican immigrant father and Indian immigrant mother, and how she represents the new American demography, or this American demographic shift. And the article talked about the rise of the new wave of children of immigrants. In places like California, half of all children come from immigrant homes. And nationally, over 1/4 of American-born children are born to immigrant parents. 1/6 of the adult population of the United States is foreign-born. So as I'm reading this article, I'm reading it with a little bit of New Bedford pride, thinking this was New Bedford at the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century. In 1865, at the height of the whaling industry, only 14% of the city's population was foreign-born. By 1900, because of the textile industry, that number soared to 40.9%. During the mid-19th century, the Irish came to the city to flee famine. Later, people from England, the residents in New Bedford from England doubled as they came to work as weavers and spinners in factories. French Canadians immigrated in the years after the Civil War to work in mills. And Portuguese from the mainland and Madeira began immigrating after 1870 and joined earlier immigrants from the Azores and Cabo Verde, making New Bedford, making the Portuguese-speaking population the largest immigrant community in New Bedford, up to the present. At the turn of the century, migrants from other locations such as Greece, the Middle East, and areas of Eastern Europe began making New Bedford home. And in recent decades, significant Central American, Dominican, South American, and Asian communities have also flourished in the city. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to show you some images that explore these communities in our Standard Times collection. These are all reproductions from glass plate negatives that were featured in the New Bedford Evening Standard circa 1905. We have quite a collection of these images from that time period, but here I pulled some images that focus on immigrants and immigration. This all started with me trying to put together an exciting and inexpensive exhibit, and if you happen to see it when it was in the museum last summer, Portraits of a City. I found some of the images so compelling that I spent about a week at the Free Public Library going through microfilm to get the actual articles associated with the images in our collection. The research often provided names of people in the images and much needed context. By 1907, New Bedford was in the one of the top 10 ports for immigration. It was number 9. By June 30th of that year, there were 2,315 immigrants from the Azores, 349 from Cabo Verde, 3 Greeks, 6 Hebrews, 4 Italians, and 5 Spaniards. And it was noted in this article that regardless of wealth, as long as the person wasn't deemed likely to become a public charge and they were in good health, they would be allowed into the city. Arrival of new immigrant groups that are perceived as different can be met with resistance or outright rejection. And while some of the Standard Times articles about immigrant communities reveal racism or ethnocentrism of the day, sometimes the rise of immigrant communities was celebrated in the news. In this image, the city welcomes John Duca, the first Greek baby born in the city on November 4th, 1904. George Duca, John's father, had lived in New Bedford for 9 years and worked in a local restaurant. At the time, there were few Greeks in the city. It was said that the festival that took place after John's christening was something that was commonplace in places like Boston, Lowell, and Providence. But in New Bedford, where the Greek population was in the single digits, the festivities did not go unnoticed. The number of Greek and Turkish-born Greek immigrants sharply increased at the turn of the century due to years of Balkan conflicts. Many Greek men worked in the cotton mills, and by 1910, New Bedford had 4 Greek cafes. This community worked diligently to maintain the Greek Orthodox faith and Greek language among Greeks in New Bedford. Italian immigrants began arriving in New Bedford in the late 19th century in very small numbers. By 1900, the number of Italian immigrants grew substantially. Wealthier North Italian immigrants often owned buildings where poorer agricultural Southern Italian immigrants would board in the section of the city called Holy Acre. Others worked on railroads in construction, or sold produce and roasted peanuts, and most grew grapes in small gardens. This is an image from Little Italy, which was established in the North End by Italian railroad workers. It was a settlement of about 100 laborers, including some women and children. Little Italy had its own general store, parlor, and police force. Some built shelters, but most lived in crudely constructed huts, which you see in this image here. This is a picture of an adolescent identified in the article as Voglio, posing outside of a hut with his friend. And it was also noted in the article that Voglio followed the photographer around the settlement, asking him about his camera and if he could purchase his camera, and asking the photographer to take many pictures of him. And so when he brought him over to his hut with his friend was very reluctant to have his photo taken, which is why he's looking down at the table rather than into the camera. It was said that in 1906, the Polish colony, quote, affords a striking example of the rapidity with which one class of people may spread in a community within a few years without the fact becoming impressively apparent, end quote. In 1894, the Kilanovich family was reportedly the only Polish family in New Bedford. After the textile strike of 1898, that number swelled to 2,000 individuals. They were mostly from the rural region of Galicia, and they were the largest Central European group in the city. Most were skilled weavers, and some branched out into the grocery business. It was also said in this article that the Poles were very clannish, stuck to themselves. The Polish settlement that was part of the Wamsutter Mill housing blocks, where this picture of Polish children was taken, began construction in the North End around 1860. Each floor had 2 4-room apartments on each side of the house, and each apartment had use of 2 rooms on the 3rd floor. And there were 2 basement toilets in each building. And it's also noteworthy that often residents in the Polish colony took on boarders who were also Polish. It's worth noting that while Chinese students who visited New Bedford in 1906 were met with much fanfare, this also occurred against a backdrop of national anti-Asian sentiment. This particular article highlights that the students' ability to assimilate to American culture and customs would enable them to rejuvenate their native land as China worked toward unwrapping herself from her ancient cloak of darkness. While many immigrant groups were tolerated and able to establish enclaves, some were purposefully pushed out. If you look at the 1887 New Bedford City Directory, which is the document on the left, 9 of the 11 listed laundries were Chinese. By 1919, and that's the document on the right, the city directory, there was only 1 listing for a Chinese laundry, which didn't even have a business name. It was simply listed as Chinese in parentheses above the address. And so if we think about this time period, throughout the 19th century, the late 19th century, the earliest Chinese immigrants prospered in this niche market of owning and operating laundries. And they did this from coast to coast. The first opened in San Francisco in 1851. Due to a number of factors, again, including this increasing national anti-Chinese sentiment, and following the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the recognition that laundries required very little investment and generated large profits, Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were pushed out of this niche market. Successful Chinese laundries now found themselves facing new regulations requiring permits, which they often were not granted. In the middle of the 19th century, German Jewish immigrants began to settle in New Bedford. By 1870, there was a thriving Jewish community, and throughout the city, there were several shops and establishments owned by Jewish immigrants. In the late 1870s, Eastern European Jews also began migrating to New Bedford. The synagogue in this image, built in 1904 and located on Kenyon Street in the North End, was the second synagogue constructed in the city. It was destroyed in the late 1950s to make room for a highway through the city. New Bedford is currently home to a vibrant Jewish community with organizations such as Tifereth Israel Synagogue and the Jewish Federation of Greater New Bedford. Cape Verdeans began arriving in substantial numbers after the 1850s, and it's said that Cape Verdean immigration began with whalers who brought the culture around the globe. A significant portion of the population was descended from Portuguese colonists and African slaves who spoke Creole, sort of a mixture of African languages and Portuguese. Azorians and Cape Verdeans made desirable crew members for whale ships because of their local maritime traditions. Cape Verdean men were eager to escape colonial mismanagement, frequent droughts, and frequent famines by signing on to whaling voyages. By the 1920s, a majority of officers and harpooners on the 13 remaining New Bedford whalers hailed from Cabo Verde. The legacy of this maritime heritage remains strong in New Bedford's Cape Verdean community and is celebrated as an essential self-defining feature within the community. At least 70% of Cape Verdean immigrants to the US between 1800 and 1921 arrived through New Bedford, a main port of the Cape Verdean diaspora. And to this day, because of that, New Bedford is known as the Cape Verdean Ellis Island. Initially, the whaling industry drove this migration, but after the industry waned, Cape Verdeans began to manage their own migration via the packet industry, and what you're seeing on the right of this slide is the packet ship, the Savoia. Packet ships were used to transport both goods and people back and forth between New Bedford and Cabo Verde. Over 105 years, Cape Verdean Americans captained 890 packet voyages, and 250 voyage ships were owned by Cape Verdean Americans. Most left from Brava, so the industry became known as the Brava packet trade, though the ships brought Cape Verdeans from all islands. Voyages were often seasonal, with workers traveling from Cabo Verde to harvest cranberries and other agricultural produce, and then returning to Cabo Verde once the season ended. And if you think about it, this circular migration created enduring ties between the islands and New Bedford. Crew recruitment onto whaling ships also marked the beginning of waves of Azorian immigration to the US, mostly to New Bedford. So many concentrated on the south end, it became known as Little Fayal, as Fayal was the predominant isle of origin for Azorian immigrants to New Bedford. The existence of this community was the main factor in New Bedford once again becoming a main port for Azorian immigration in 1958, after the eruption of the Capelinos volcano on Horta on the island of Fayal. Because of the enduring ties between Azorian communities here and in the Azores during the catastrophe, Senators John Pastore of Rhode Island and John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts signed the Azorian Refugee Act, dramatically increasing the number of Azorians permitted to enter the US. In 1972, Horta became a sister city of New Bedford. But going back to the era of North American whaling, the first immigrants to arrive in significant numbers to US shores were in fact Azorians disembarking onto the docks of New Bedford. They were eager to find economic opportunities or to escape conscription in the Portuguese army, and also to cope with a shrinking land base due to population increases. So they left their islands as crewmen on Yankee whalers and settled in New Bedford. Because of this early Portuguese migration, the oldest Portuguese parish in the United States, St. John the Baptist, was founded in 1871 and dedicated in 1875. And you'll see when you visit the Inside Out exhibition, we have a photograph of this first Portuguese parish, which was on the corner of Wing and 5th Streets, but it was destroyed by fire in 1908. A new church was dedicated in 1913 on the corner of County and Allen Streets. The parish was eventually closed in 2012 by the Diocese of Fall River because of declining attendance and shifting demographics in the city. The closure was, of course, heartbreaking for many parishioners, but also represents the overall decline in ethnic parishes in the United States over the last several decades. As the whaling industry declined at the turn of the century, many Portuguese immigrants had to shift to alternative industries and day laboring. Some built shanties on Potomska Street, which you see here in this picture, on the waterfront. And so this is right on the docks. And they built these for storage, shelter, and to be close to employment opportunities at sea or on boats. The small shanty town that was created was known as the Portuguese Navy Yard. The Portuguese Navy Yard persisted until the Hurricane of '38, which completely destroyed the settlement. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was putting together this exhibit was this program at the Smithsonian, which I invite you to sort of replicate when you come and see the Inside Out exhibition on the plaza, where they just show a picture for 20 minutes to an audience, and the audience examines the picture just to discuss all of the different things they pick up in the picture. And I think this is one of those images that would be a great a great 20-minute session, just sort of picking this picture apart. The Portuguese Navy Yard was described as having two kings, being a cooperative community, and exemplifying the concept of democracy. And here's another sketch from the Standard Times. And again, this is one of those things that I came across by spending about a week total at the Free Public Library going through microfilm to find some of the articles associated with the images we have in our collection. And this was a great one of the two kings of the Portuguese Navy Yard and some of the ongoing activities there. There were many more immigrant communities at the turn of the century, including French Canadians, German and Eastern European Jews, Middle Easterners, and others. The Inside Out exhibition has many more images than the ones I've shown you this evening, and it describes snapshots of these immigrant communities, such as the Holy Acre section of the city, which was described as a dirty and dangerous place. But it was home to many immigrant groups, including Irish Italians, Greeks, and Middle Easterners, who came to New Bedford to work in the mills, works, coal yards, and in trading. The neighborhood was originally built by Irish immigrants. And just a quote about the neighborhood: "They made the town. From them it came to be called Holy Acre and was known as a little emerald isle amid a population of nationalities." The area was considered by New Bedford's Anglo establishment as an unsavory and dangerous section of town, which, quote, "has long been a menace to the health of this community." And so when you think about these shifting ideas towards immigration as time went on, it wasn't just New Bedford, but throughout textile and manufacturing towns of the Northeast, mounting anti-immigration settlement was fueled by competition for male jobs. Ironically, as the whaling industry declined and the textile industry emerged, fewer working class white men wanted to engage in the dirty and dangerous work of whaling. So the number of Native American, African American, and other immigrant whalers sharply increased. But immigrants began to be seen as a significant problem when they also began leaving whaling and seeking out and getting factory jobs. Our city of immigrants changed by 1917 as the US Congress began to enact more restrictive immigration laws, which sought to decrease or eliminate immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Africa, and what was known as the, quote, Asiatic barred zone. In addition to mandatory literacy tests now becoming part of the immigration process, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act allowed for only 2% of the total number of each nationality that was in the United States in 1890 to be allowed into the country every year after 1924. This act also completely excluded Asians except for the Japanese and Filipinos, And Japanese were still allowed into the country because of the so-called gentleman's agreement between the US and Japan, which was shortly thereafter broken, and Japanese were also excluded. Filipinos were exempt because the Philippines was at the time a US colony or US territory. The ultimate purpose of this restrictive immigration was to preserve the idea of US homogeneity. And it was defended by Johnson as follows. And I'm going to read a rather long quote that justifies this 1924 Immigration Act. "We believe that our best interests will be served by keeping the United States as far as possible a white man's country. Our own history, as well as the history of other countries, affords many examples of the serious difficulties that arise when members of very diverse races come into intimate contact. We cannot assimilate the yellow, brown, and black races. There is a need at the present time of excluding other dark-skinned races, a need which will undoubtedly increase unless some action is taken. One would think our Negro problem is already large enough without adding to it that way. Since we have applied the principle of exclusion to such people as the Chinese and Japanese, we should go the whole way and totally exclude Black immigrant aliens." The restrictive policies ended in the 1960s, and the elimination of Johnson-Reed policies, post-World War II posterity in the US, and the decolonization of former empires, which led to the creation of the Third World, led to a surge in migration to the US. By this time, New Bedford was a different city, but still a migration hub. Although the Lusophone community is still the largest immigrant group in the city, due to the whaling industry and the paths it created, New Bedford's reputation as an immigrant hub has been consistent throughout history, and many groups have followed the paths of migration when whaling declined, the textile industry replaced it, and even up to the present. For example, Madeiran immigrants, who did not migrate on whale ships, but were nonetheless attracted by an existing Lusophone community and opportunities for labor, are a significant part of the fabric of New Bedford. And of course, it didn't happen this year, but every year up until 2020, they've held the largest Portuguese festa in the world in New Bedford. We are also home to the annual Festival Típico de Guatemala and the Guatemalan Kite Festival, and many other national and ethnic celebrations, some of which are featured here. There are multiple enduring communities that actively maintain their language, history, and culture throughout New Bedford and truly make it a city of immigrants to this day. In fact, last year I attended a naturalization ceremony at the Immigration Assistance Center. And one thing really struck me that the judge there said to everyone, I think there were about 27 people getting their citizenship that day. She stressed that it was very important that they hold on to their culture and their homeland. And now they are also able to embrace the United States and New Bedford. One of New Bedford's most prized legacies of the whaling industry is that it created a city that's a mosaic, one that is composed of multiple immigrant groups and a richness of cultures that come together in their diversity and make New Bedford the culturally vibrant, multicultural, and unique city it is today. So I thank you very much for putting up with that slide presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Yes, and you're welcome to put them in the chat, and Akeia can see them and respond. Or you can, I think, Jocelyn, unmute oneself in order to ask live if you like.
So I always wonder when there's a pause before questions come at the end of one of these, if I don't get any questions, does that mean I did a really good job or a really bad job?
Well, I'm pretty sure Carl Cruz would have a question. Or Rick is in there. And I have a question. So if one wanted to search the Standard Times collection and see, I know that you did retain some of these from your presentation because we're trying to encourage people to come and see the show itself on the plaza. But if one wanted to kind of go through Standard Times collection, how do they do that?
So because we have labeled all of the images Standard Times, if you do it through our search engine at the museum, on our search page, the images will come up.
And I love the story of the Italian, what's his name again?
Voglio.
Voglio. There's the best picture of him on the plaza with a cast iron pan, and you can tell he's just a complete ham and trying to get as many pictures as possible.
Yeah, you definitely get that sense from the article that he was just following around the photographer all day and asking him to take his picture. And again, I found out that whole story and that his name was Voglio, and the story about Voglio and his friend by doing that research on the microfilm, which was sort of difficult because all I had were the images and the year. So some of the microfilm some of the years have 3 or 4 different microfilm rolls. So it was just going through them very slowly and waiting until I saw a picture that I recognized from that exhibit and then reading the article.
Well, that's great. We did such an in-depth presentation, and I did see a question from Emma York. When will the show be on the plaza?
It is on the plaza now. It just went up this morning. And so it's double-sided, so make sure you loop around to the back. You'll recognize, I think, 2 or 3 of the pictures from tonight. I didn't want to inundate you with pictures from the exhibit because I wanted to encourage you to go and be able to look at them up close on your own and read the descriptions. But it is there. It's there now and will be for the next 2 weeks.
Great. And I think the connection to Kamala is obviously so important. And Maria did mention great presentation and so timely on, I'm sure, many fronts. Oh, and a question from Stacy. I get confused with Azorians, Cape Verdeans, etc. They all speak Portuguese? Question mark.
Great question. Yes and asterisk, right? So if you think about sort of the 16th, 17th centuries, you think about the empire of Portugal. So there was the mainland, there were Portuguese colonies in Asia, there were Portuguese colonies in Africa, including Cape Verde. There was the Azores and Madeira, and if I didn't say it already, of course, Brazil. And so, yes, all of these countries are Portuguese-speaking countries. But Cabo Verde, the language that most people speak in the home, and speak in conversation with one another is Creole, which is that, and I'm going to go anthropologist for a second here, but if we think about 2 different language groups that come into contact, they have to be able to communicate with one another. And so if you've ever heard of a pidgin language, that's what emerges first. And the pidgin comes from the word business. It's a way of 2 different people who speak 2 different languages being able to do basic business transactions with one another. Once the next generation speaks that pidgin language as their language, right? Once it goes through one generation, then it's called a Creole language, and it becomes the lingua franca. And so in Cabo Verde, Creole is the common language, and there's a push to actually have that, by many, to have that be the official language as a point of pride. If this is what most people speak in the household, why should Portuguese, formal Portuguese, be the official language? But you do hear, when you listen to Creole, you hear many, many Portuguese words within the language. So thank you, Stacy, for asking that. I think because my family is Cape Verdean, and because we're in New Bedford, and there are so many Cape Verdeans and Azorians and Madeirans that things like that are often taken for granted and not explained very well.
I'm just going to read a few other comments coming in. Thank you very much. From Laura, Stacy did a really good job. I look forward to visiting. Maria, great presentation, so timely. And from Elizabeth, thank you for your overview of immigration to New Bedford. I moved here because of the wonderful ethnic diversity. And then from Anne, thank you for exploring this important subject. So turn of the century immigration had such a great impact on the development of the city. And then from Elizabeth, could you talk more about how we as a community to increase relationships among a myriad of people?
So if I'm interpreting that correctly, I'm guessing that you're asking how sort of in a multicultural city, we improve relationships among these different communities. And I'm glad you asked that, because it gives me an opportunity to bring up a really important initiative that we are embarking on at the museum right now, which is, it's called Common Ground. And we are hoping to explore these various communities in New Bedford today through storytelling. So by collecting community stories and then sharing those stories, archiving those stories, collecting objects and photographs and manuscripts from people in the community to be able to put them together. And I mentioned the word mosaic a couple of times in this presentation. And so the reason that that word or that concept comes to mind is when I think of New Bedford, I think of all of these, you know, apparently different looking pieces that come together to paint a singular picture. And so I think with community initiatives that encourage that kind of sharing of stories, it's not, you know, the whole answer, but it's one answer in how we begin that sort of improvement of relationships amongst different communities in the city. I think it was last week, all of these presentations are sort of blending together for me at this point, but we did a presentation for this project. And we have if you go to the Common Ground project page on our website, there's an area where you can upload a video to tell your story. And these are stories about neighborhoods, or stories about your family, or immigration stories, or stories about your job. We just really want any story that people want to tell. And I played one of these stories that a 16-year-old recorded for us, and it was about cooking with her mother and how that's really how she bonds with her mother, who's from Panama. And one of the other participants at the presentation emailed me afterwards and told me she got very teary-eyed listening to this 16-year-old who was Panamanian talk about cooking with her mom, because even though she's from a completely different country, different place, different experience, she very much related to that that feeling of you know, of just cooking with your mom, and what kind of relationship that builds between mother and daughter. And so I told her, you know, even though I felt sort of bad about it because she said it made her cry, I got really excited and said, that's exactly what I want to happen. People to see that even though they come from these different backgrounds and they have different stories, that there's something that they all have in common. And that's sort of that's the common ground. That's the story of New Bedford.
Yeah, please, can you mention quickly how people can participate?
Yes, so a couple of different ways you can participate. I would definitely recommend going to the, and I'll type it actually in the chat. Hopefully that's the right line. It's on our website, and it talks in quite some detail about the project and what we're trying to do with the project. And it gives you a couple of options for sharing stories. And I'll just tell you very briefly, there right now 3 ways you can share a story, but I'm open to all sort of methods of storytelling. One, you can email a story to stories@whalingmuseum.org. You can upload a video to our web platform. It allows you to do a 10-minute video. You can do as many as you would like. Or you can send it through the regular mail, which surprisingly I've gotten quite a few stories through the mail, through the snail mail. So feel free to send them that way. If you want to tell your story, but you'd rather stay anonymous, we've gotten a few stories where people have requested that, and we'll absolutely respect that. But really, any way that you want to participate, whether it's through written story, video, sharing objects that tell a story about you or your family or the city, right now it's all open. So what we're trying to do, really, the exhibit doesn't open until 2022, and we are not creating a narrative for the exhibit until we have these stories and we have these objects, because we really want it to be the community telling the story and not us. So we really don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but I would definitely encourage you to share your stories, and we can sort of do a before and after, right? With the presentation I gave tonight, that's turn of the century, and we can talk about 2020 New Bedford through 2022 New Bedford in this exhibit.
And I do have Deanna, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Did I see on one of those posters that there was a wall, a physical wall proposed in an earlier era? And then from Carl, what years are you using for this exhibit?
So Deanna, I'm not exactly clear on your question. I'm wondering if you're talking about the sort of anti-immigration posters that were up. Those were...
There was a literary one also.
Okay.
I saw, I don't know if that's the one that Deanna means, but oh yes.
Yeah, so I think that those were supposed to be symbolic. You see a lot of images from that era with things like funnels, where there are boatloads of people pulling into port, and there are some people standing on the docks with funnels, and maybe 1 or 2 people are getting through, right, the narrow end of the funnel. So although timely, though, I think the walls in those images were pretty symbolic. I don't think that there was actually a wall at that time. And to answer Carl's question, for Common Ground, I'm sort of being loose about it at this point, just within the storyteller's lifetime. And that doesn't exclude, of course, if you have a story about your parents or how your parents got here, because I think that's an important piece of the puzzle too. But really what we're trying to do is put together a story of New Bedford now, through stories about the lived experience of people in New Bedford now, or people who lived in New Bedford or have moved elsewhere. I know that's very vague, but I hope that somewhat answers your question.
And the one that's on the plaza now, that's all turn of the century.
That's all turn of the century. And so what I noticed was there were a lot of immigrant/immigrant community/immigration stories circa 1905. I think the most recent image from the exhibit on the plaza is 1914, and that would be the image of the immigrants from Cabo Verde on the packet ship coming over. And I just used it because I happen to love that particular image. The newspaper article about the school in Harwich was from 1905 as well. And that's a really interesting article because there was a proposal at the time that immigrant children from Cabo Verde be placed in a separate school. And a lot of people said, well, that's incredibly racist, and we're not going to do that. And the justification, the proponents of having the separate school said it wasn't about race, it was about the children being unclean and spreading disease. And so there was a little back and forth about that school. And I don't know that I ever followed up to see if that actually happened. I suspect no, but that article was from the same time period as the other pictures, 1905.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate, Mike Dyer, who's our curator of maritime history, and Akeia and I have had many philosophical discussions about common ground and what that really means as a groundbreaking project for the museum. But rather than our looking back on material from 100 years ago and recreating stories, this is an opportunity for people to tell their own stories. And that, as Akeia said, is driving the exhibit. So it's done kind of in a reverse order, which is really exciting and I think very relevant and very timely. And certainly this Inside Out exhibit has a lot to do with that connection of all these different communities. So I really hope that all of you take a chance to go in and look at it and also explore online and email Akeia or any of us to ask questions in the future about what the Standard Times collection means. I mean, our goal is really to digitize it and make it very available and do a major exhibit of that as well. But a plug to also Allison Wells's exhibition is technically open today. I was sitting in it and it's absolutely fabulous, and she's part of the Common Ground project, and there are QR codes on each label, and I'm fairly technically savvy, but this is really easy. Instead of having an opening tonight, which was planned originally for a month ago, Akeia and Allison worked together to create these QR code YouTube short videos on each piece, so you can sit in there and listen to the artist actually speak about each piece. And then Elizabeth Perry is opening on what day, Akeia?
Elizabeth's exhibit it's called Ripples, period, through a Wampanoag lens. And it's also part of the Common Ground project. And Elizabeth is showcasing some of her work with wampum, which is just gorgeous. I was showing Christina some of the images earlier today after I met with Elizabeth. But you'll see in her exhibit the panels we created, and it's all her words and her writing with very little editing from me. But the thing that I love about her panels is they tell the story of her, right? Her now through her ancestors and the environment and the work that she does in Native arts and culture. And so one really wonderful thing for me is that her exhibition will be right next door to Allison's exhibition. So you get these two women, one who is Native American, one who is an immigrant from the Caribbean in 2020. So we're having all this talk about 19th Amendment and women and immigration, and I think that having them in that part of the museum in these two fabulous galleries with their fabulous work is so wonderful and timely, and I feel very fortunate that we were able to bring them into the museum to do these exhibitions.
Well, thank you, Akeia. And I see Carl has one more comment. Hope you will include Ola Church from First Cape Verdean Church, 1905.
In this exhibition, no, Carl. I only had room for 10 images, so I couldn't put everything in there about immigration during that time period. But yeah, let's talk, because I think that will figure really integrally into Common Ground, Our Lady of the Assumption. It just, I couldn't put it in this particular exhibition.
Great. Well, thanks. Does anyone have any other comments? I know that Jocelyn has a closing slide that she wants to include about our next project, where Emma Rocha is curating an exhibition called A Moment in Time, which will open on Thursday, September 3rd. And we'll have talk about that at 5:30 on that evening on, I assume, the same platform, as that is close in the future. Any other comments from anyone? Or well, thank you. That was a very nice, wonderful comments, wonderful questions. Thanks, Akeia. That was a fabulous presentation, and I certainly learned a lot. And the Inside Out project is a lot of fun. It's really just a way for us to bring things outside, and everything that you see there is inside. And just for Carl and all the other collections committee members on the line, Nothing original will be outside. But everything that's out there, you can see in the museum as well or online. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I'll leave Akeia to say goodnight to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your feedback and input and you sitting through my presentation, and hope to have many more interactions like this in the future. And please do come to the plaza to see the Inside Out exhibition. I'm not sure if it's airing right at 11, but tomorrow I am having a conversation with someone from WJAR on the Inside Out exhibitions, sort of why we're doing it and the thinking behind it. And I'll be talking about the exhibit that's up now, which is the one that we've been talking about tonight. So if you can catch that on their Facebook live stream, you'll hear a little more about Inside Out exhibitions. So again, thanks for joining us tonight.